All right. Hi, everybody. As promised, I wanted to create another series of videos that will help you get started on your studying for the Unit 4 test. I decided to include the essential questions and the guided questions on this slide, but I don't want to spend the time going through them. But it is very important for you to still consider these questions rather than to just skip to the content slides when you're studying, because you can use them to anticipate potential TEA prompts or even potential ways of analyzing material that you may come across in a multiple choice question, for example, that might be more complex. On top of that, the image analysis tends to require deeper thought, so these questions can also certainly help inform your understanding of a potential visual source. And lastly, even the block paragraph. You can certainly use these questions to help drive the way in which you construct your narrative. Guided questions, same kind of thing. In fact, when you're studying the terms list, you should probably think about how some of these different terms are related to these questions. And let's get into the major content. By the way, this is probably going to take a couple of different videos to get through, so I'm only going to do one tonight and I'll finish the next one tomorrow, so stay tuned for that. So again, I don't really want to spend too much time going through each of these bullet points with a fine-tooth comb. This was really meant to initiate our discussion on the unit and thinking about how diverse the Middle East as a whole is. We're not even just talking about Israel and Palestine here, we're talking about the entire Middle Eastern Arab world, right? So first off, it's a very, very diverse place culturally, religiously. The language groups are very, very diverse. And within that, even though we know that there are three predominant monotheistic religions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, there are different levels of those religions, of course, and there are different sects of those religions. So it's not all black and white, right? So even when you live in a certain place that might be majority one religion, let's say you live in Israel, for example, and you're Jewish. Well, you may be Reform and someone else may be Orthodox, someone else may be even secular. So it is important for us to realize that even the same religion is not equal per se. Uh, in terms of resources, this is very crucial, and we've talked about the richness of oil in the Middle East quite a bit throughout the unit, so I don't think we need to belabor this point. In terms of governments, it's important for us to realize that not all of the Middle Eastern governments are the same. Some of them, like Israel and Turkey, for example, are a democracy, which hold elections. Some of them are still ruled by monarchies. So, for example, Jordan and Saudi Arabia both have a monarch. There's a king of Jordan, right, and a prince of Saudi Arabia. Also, you see that in Iraq and Syria there are actual dictatorial leadership positions, and so that also has its own complexity there. And lastly, some of these places are theocratic governments, so that means that they are a religious state. Iran is a good example of that. That is a Muslim state, and countries that are more theocratic in nature, Muslim countries specifically that are more theocratic in nature, tend to be very opposed to Western traditions. All right, so the first term I believe that's on our list is the mandate system. So let's bring ourselves way back to the years right after World War One, right? We know that the Ottoman Empire collapsed with the end of World War One, and some of the former portions of the last bits of its empire were divided up into what are called mandates. Now, mandates were meant to pave the way for full independence, but in some ways we could see mandates as a quasi colony. Western countries controlled the mandates, and the ultimate justification behind them was that a mandate would eventually be a sovereign nation. Although, of course, we know that with the story of Israel and Palestine, it's much more complex. And just take a moment here to pause and look to see which Western European country has a mandate over which Middle Eastern country. All right, so why are we so concerned with the state of Israel-Palestine? Well, first off, it's important for us to realize that both of these major groups of people claim a religious homeland in the region, more specifically the city of Jerusalem. It's also important for us to realize that there's an historical context here, that the British promised the Jewish population throughout Europe, the diasporic population, that they would have a homeland and it would exist somewhere in the Middle East. And the year 1917 matters. Why? Because think about what was happening in 1917. World War I is almost over. And so the Balfour Declaration, to a large extent, uh, was also riding on the heels of a wave of nationalism for the countries that were about to see a major victory. Also, the British were facing some pressure with regard to the Zionist movement. Anti Semitism was alive and well in Western countries and other non Western countries for that matter. And so the British did feel obligated to adhere to the Jewish people's desire for a state of their own. Remember that this is all within the context of the age of nationalism. And lastly, even after, or rather second to last, after the Balfour Declaration, even though it did lead to some Jewish migration into the British Mandate of Palestine, it was a very small amount of migration at first. And lastly, it's important for us to realize that over time, especially when World War II comes to an end, there's a greater sense of Arab nationalism or pan-Arabism that is going to lead to increasing resentment of the presence of Jews in this region, and that will lead to increased violence. And of course, we know that because Israel becomes an independent state in 1948, that this pan-Arabism is happening at a very crucial time, a time when tension is already quite high. Lastly, we talked about this graph a lot in class, but it's worthwhile to take a look at what happens in certain years. All right, so for example, the Holocaust, we could say, let's sort of put it in around 1933 when Hitler is elected Chancellor of Germany. The Nuremberg laws shortly thereafter. Notice how quickly the Jewish population starts to spike in the British Mandate of Palestine. That is a direct correlation, of course, to the situations in the Holocaust in certain areas of Europe. You might also ask what this dip is about. Well, this dip is actually, as you can see, the Arab population. So you did see, along with the initial migration, that there was a slight decrease in population among Arab people. And that is for a number of reasons that you could certainly analyze, but I don't want to spend too much more time there. Let's talk about the mandate, or rather, we talked about the mandate, let's talk about the partition. So, fast forward. The partition was 1947, and this was drafted by the United Nations General Assembly, and what they were trying to do was respond to increased tension in the region, right? You can see that in this map on the left that there was an increased Jewish presence in some key areas. Of course, the holy city of Jerusalem, but then some surrounding areas, including the city of Tel Aviv and Haifa. Okay, so the bombing of the King David Hotel, which there's a video about at one point, but just getting back to this, that happened in 1946. That was seen as a major terrorist attack on the Palestinian headquarters and also the headquarters of the British Army. And so after that, there was a very acute desire for change in the region. So this is when the UN decides to make this partition plan. And so you, I feel, know a lot about this, but let's just take a look at this map yet again. This is what the partition actually looked like, right? So as of 1947, you see that everything that's indicated in orange on this map was part of the Jewish state of Israel, or what will become Israel, rather, the next year. And then the yellow portions of the map were designated as Arab regions. And of course, you can see in the middle here that Jerusalem was left to remain an international city, and it was to be administered by the United Nations. And so this partition almost immediately, if not it already was there in a lot of ways, but there's immediate backlash and civil war, guerrilla war, rather, breaks out in this region. And so Israel decides to declare independence on May 14th, 1948, and the Israeli War for Independence started the next day. Now, the Israeli War for Independence is also called the 1948-1949 War, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. Um, but in any event, this is a result of the British withdrawing their military from the Mandate right at the same time that Israel declares its independence. So the British flag goes down and the Israeli flag goes up. So what we see, of course, is that there are a number of immediate effects of this partition, that there is an immediate introduction of Palestinian refugees when they live in certain areas that were designated to Israel. So depending on where they lived, occasionally, and quite often rather, they would flee to their neighboring countries. All right, and you can see those indicated here. And lastly, of course, we know that this is an ongoing issue, that there was violence, of course, before the partition, but it escalates dramatically after that and is a continuing problem today. All right, we're going to stop here because this map has a lot going on. So let's pick up with a part 2 soon. All right, hope this helps you get started with your studying. Thanks.